minstrel shows were only one small portion of the degradation that was going on to African Americans. They were also prevented from voting. Although the 15th Amendment granted them voting rights, there were certain restrictions that kept most African Americans from voting. One was the literacy test. The literacy test tested reading ability, often consisted of very hard questions, also often consisted of unfair questions or historical questions that even many white people couldn't answer. These were used to keep African Americans from voting in the South. Also, sometimes a poll tax was instituted, and this was an annual fee that had to be paid in order to vote. This too kept African Americans from voting in the South. A third restriction was known as the grandfather clause, and this said that if your grandfather could vote in 1860, then you could vote now. This was written into law, so if you failed the literacy test and or couldn't pay the poll tax, you could still vote. This only, of course, applied to white people because people who came here as slaves didn't have a grandfather who could vote in 1860. Again, this was used to exclude African Americans, make sure that poor, illiterate white people could still vote. In 1896, the case Plessy versus Ferguson came to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, in this case, ruled against Plessy and said that separate but equal is okay. In other words, businesses can provide separate facilities for African Americans as long as the facilities are equal. As long as that's done, it does not violate the 14th Amendment. And this allows legalized segregation to occur for 60 years. In the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, you may remember from civics that that was a case where a African American man, took a seat in a white car on a railroad train. And he was thrown off the train, and he took his case to the Supreme Court and lost. Also, there was different ways in which white and African American people interacted, especially in the South. There was something known as racial etiquette. And these are informal rules and customs that govern interactions between whites and blacks. You think of etiquette, or they're sort of unspoken rules. You think of table etiquette. These are things that you know you should do at the table. These are things that people understood should be done when interacting with African Americans or African Americans interacting with whites. So some examples are white and African American people didn't shake hands. African Americans had to yield to whites if they were walking. They often used separate sidewalks. And African Americans, it was understood that they would look down, especially when interacting with a white woman. And these codes of etiquette were used to regulate African Americans in the South. So many African Americans, of course, moved towards the North in search of less discrimination and better jobs. And usually the situation there was somewhat better, although they still faced many challenges, including segregated neighborhoods, labor unions that excluded African Americans, lower wages, and also discrimination in terms of hiring. They were often hired as a last resort. One of the tactics used by, that should be execution, one of the tactics used by the KKK in the South to frighten African Americans and keep them under their thumb was lynching. And lynching is execution without a trial. One of the reformers who was most concerned with lynching was Ida B. Wells, and she had 3 prominent friends lynched, and of course, because of that, became a very strong advocate against lynching and racial injustice. The photograph on the right is a lynching that took place in 1908 in Springfield, Illinois, when an angry mob of white people tried to attack 2 African American prisoners that were being held in the local jail. When the prisoners were moved to ensure their safety, the mob took out their anger on several other African Americans in the community, innocent bystanders, and this was the result. In the next video, we're going to talk about some of the key reformers who advocated for equality for African Americans, as well as some discrimination against other ethnicities during the Progressive Era.